So first off, congratulations to my opponent for making it to the second round of the tournament. Thank you for taking this debate, and thank you, Call Out, for hosting the tournament once again. So I'm going to jump right into my opening statement here. No means of distributing wealth has increased the quality of life for as many people as capitalism. Given the fact that we live on a planet of finite resources, it is in the best interest of the human race to find the most efficient means of allocating those resources. Any infringement upon the free and open exchange of goods and services is an unnecessary constraint upon the prosperity of all of humanity. For the purpose of this debate, the funds that I propose be removed from Planned Parenthood are the monies levied against a person with no regards to their consent. If money is taken from a person against their consent by any other entity other than the government, it is considered theft. Thus, my argument is not against Planned Parenthood per se, but rather for the unfettered marketplace. The challenge I lay to my opponent is first to justify why anyone should have the fruits of their labors taken against their will, and secondly, to explain why the government should interfere in an essential service when the private marketplace could provide that same service in a more economical way. And as a humorous side note, I just sliced my finger open. So I'm going to pass the mic to you.
Okay, so I find it really weird that I'm going to be sitting here arguing as to why or whether or not the government has a right to take money from people in the form of taxes and things. I don't quite understand that, because the debate here is whether or not that money should be given or not given to Planned Parenthood, and whether or not that funding goes there. The debate is not whether or not the government has a right to take that money from the people individually, but whether or not the government has the obligation to be spending it on this particular thing. I don't think that it's then fair for you to challenge me to try and prove that taking away that money is justified, because at the end of the day, that means that I then have to prove that it's justifiable to take money away from people to spend on literally everything that the government spends on, when that's not the debate here. The debate here is about Planned Parenthood. And so I would like to know why we're straying away from there and then arguing as to whether or not it should be taken from, whether or not the principle that it should be taken is good or bad. So take that back, because I'd like to know what your thoughts are on there.
Sure. So it is my stance that any taxation, any monies levied against people is unjust. Pretty much no matter how they're applied. The source of Planned Parenthood's funding, specifically Title X funding, of which they receive so they receive $528 million from the federal government in general. 70% of that comes from Medicaid and Medicare copays, public insurance. What I'm referring to is the Title X funding. So what's left from that. So my point is, the government has taken this money against people's will. That is unjust. It doesn't matter where they apply it, Planned Parenthood or anywhere else. Do you get what I'm saying here? You get kind of how I'm trying to broach this topic? Okay, I could try to elaborate more. Planned Parenthood receives money that is taken from people against their will in the form of taxes. That's my quibble, and that is why I think Planned Parenthood's budget should be cut, because that budget is derived from an unjust source. And I'm gonna pass it back to you. I hope that I clarified that point. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so I think when you clarified that, the idea that I got from you was that you think that the budgets for Planned Parenthood should be defunded because the money came from a source that people might not necessarily want to spend on that. Like, is that roughly your reasoning for this? Because if it is, then I don't think it's appropriate to then say that Planned Parenthood should be defunded because the means of getting that money is unjust and unethical, because then that means that spending money on literally everything that the government spends money on is unjust and unethical, because there will always be people that disagree with what the government spends money on. E.g., there are probably people in the US that don't think that the amount of money that the US spends on military and defense and those kinds of things are okay. And so it's not then just to take that money from the people who disagree with that and then spend it on something that they disagree with. By that same premise, that means that the government should not be spending any money on anything, because there will always be people who disagree with that. And by your logic, you are always taking money from those people and then spending it on things that they don't agree with. Therefore, the government spending money on anything is then unjust. And so I don't think that that's a good enough reason as to why Planned Parenthood should be defunded, because the money is unjust, because literally the government taking money from anyone is unjust, and then spending that money on literally anything then becomes unjust. And there are things that the government needs to be spending that money on. And so by that logic, I just don't quite understand why the budget for something specific should then be cancelled because the means of getting that money is unjust, when that applies to every bit of money that the government takes from people. So I'm going to pass back to you because I'm still a bit not quite sure what's happening, but I'll roll with it.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. That's exactly my point. Any money that the government levies against an individual, against that individual's consent, is unjust. So yes, reductum ad absurdum. Everything that the government spends money on is unjust. Now, you said that there are things that the government should be spending money on. I actually disagree with that. Anything that the government can do, the free market can do better, including Planned Parenthood, and including, anything that you can think of. The money levied against a person against their consent is unjust. So you know what I'm saying? You know where I'm trying to take this, or no?
Okay, so I understand that, that whole funding thing is just or unjust, and but let's talk about the free market here for a moment. So firstly, Planned Parenthood, not even half of their funding comes from the government. So only 41% comes from government funding in the forms of subsidies and things and grants and things like that they get from the federal government. But the rest of the money that they get actually comes from people who willingly donate. And so that looks like private investors, that looks like other funding methods such as fundraising. It looks like things like that. And so the thing I would say there is that the free market is actually really good, but also the free market in general, the government should be supporting that free market. And so what that means is the government should be having that federal funding to all of the institutions in that free market. So it means giving money to Planned Parenthood. It means giving money to all of the other organizations that are in the same category as Planned Parenthood. I don't really know because I'm obviously not from America, but I would suggest that that's actually a good thing. And because what that means is those organizations can then, because they're all getting money from that federal government, they can then hold the other ones accountable. And so in that instance, the free market is actually a good thing for this. But I also think that in terms of health and things like that, I think the government probably does have an obligation to be spending taxpayer dollars, considering that, that is what keeps a society going. It's there are some fundamental things that the government should be spending that money on, because otherwise people just won't be spending money on it, right? There are obviously people who disagree with what Planned Parenthood does, abortion, right? People think that all PP does is abortion. And so they're obviously not going to fund that institution. But there are also people who might not necessarily think that military and armed forces money is justified, which means that they're not going to fund them. And if you take away that government spending from those fundamental things that are incredibly important to the function of society, then people aren't going to be funding them, which then means that the society is actually detrimented in that last instance. But I feel like we should probably keep this specific to Planned Parenthood and why funding for specifically Planned Parenthood should be kept or not kept, given that that is the actual title of this debate. It doesn't matter whether or not the government taking that money in the first instance is justified or not, because what's happening is the government is already doing that. And the question is whether or not it's justified for the government to spend that money, which they've already taken on Planned Parenthood or not on Planned Parenthood, and whether or not they should be spending more or less. And so I would love to see this debate actually focus more specifically on that rather than the justification or of whether or not the government should be spending money because they took it in a bad way, because literally every cent that the government takes from a taxpayer is done unethically and unjust. And so back over to you.
So a couple of things to unpack there. I'd like to start and focus on your last sentence there. You seem to be admitting that any monies that the government takes, you seem to be in agreement with me that it's unjust or unethical. My sense is the budget should be cut from Planned Parenthood because that money taken against the people's will is unjust, is unethical. And an individual in the free market would better be able to determine how that money is allocated. So you said that the free market is good, and I agree. But as soon as the government intervenes, it is less free of a market. So, for example, the government's subsidizing Planned Parenthood. Well, that puts an undue burden upon potential competition for Planned Parenthood. So, if an entrepreneur wanted to come along and provide that same good or service in a more efficient and a better way, well, he's facing an unfair disadvantage because Planned Parenthood receives money taken against people's free will, and thereby the public at large suffers because he can't necessarily get his service to market. So you said Planned Parenthood only receives about 41% of their funding from the federal government. That's the same statistic I'm looking at, and I think that's good. If Planned Parenthood, if society desires that service, then they should be able to carry on with what they're doing, regardless of monies levied against them. Money's given to them by the federal government.
Okay, so like in terms of this whole like individual investor and things like that, I don't think that that's an appropriate way reasoning to cut the budget for Planned Parenthood, especially when all of Planned Parenthood's competition will get funding from the government because they are government run, as opposed to Planned Parenthood, which is not run by the government. And so I think, especially when like most of their funding actually, or like a significant portion of the funding for things like Planned Parenthood, and I would suggest that other health institutions in the US and also Australia are funded by private investors. I would think that that's actually probably a good thing that government funding is still there. And the reason I think that's the case is because, firstly, like I said earlier, the conception about Planned Parenthood is that all they ever do is abortions, which is just like not true. And so people are not likely to fund those institutions like Planned Parenthood because they have this weird conception about what it is and what it isn't. And so I think that at the point in which Planned Parenthood is doing something incredibly important to society and something that is incredibly beneficial to the rest of society, I think that it should have that government funding, because what they're doing is incredibly important. What they're doing is they are trying to fix the problems that like are very, very fraught in society. And so I think that deserves to have that government funding because firstly, it shows that the government is actually backing the work that they do, but it also means that Planned Parenthood is actually able to provide those services to the people who actually need them. Because what happens when you no longer have that government funding? Well, when you take away almost 50% of that funding for a specific institution, then they're going to have to get it elsewhere. And at the point in which they actually can't get that elsewhere, then it means that the services they provide are actually going to suffer because they can no longer afford to do it. And so in the case of Planned Parenthood, those services are incredibly, incredibly important to people. And if you start taking away those services, it means that people are actually more disadvantaged from not being able to access something like Planned Parenthood. And I think that that's probably a bigger harm than unjustly taking money away from someone, because that's what the government is always going to do. And so I think that at the point in which taxpayers, they are paying tax, and they might not necessarily like what the government is spending on. That is their issue to deal with. Like, I actually think that the government is justified in making people pay tax. Like, obviously the level of tax that someone pays, is fluctuating, and like I might not have an idea of exactly what it should be, but the idea of people paying tax is important because it means that the government can then divvy that up and spend it on priority areas. Because what happens is, if people are allowed to spend money on what they want and not give it to the government, and the government can't spend money, then it means that some things like Planned Parenthood or health services in general are going to suffer because people don't think that it's worth spending their money on, which is why I think the government has that obligation to intervene and provide money for those services.
So, first off, I would say any essential good or service that society requires can be provided by the free market, and provided more effectively by the free market. So you talk about the all the kind of important things that Planned Parenthood does. And I would say that being wealthy provides all those same services. So when an individual becomes wealthy or elevates in socioeconomic status, they are less likely to have unplanned pregnancies. Wealthy people have lower rates of STDs. They are more likely to have access to preventative care for cancer treatments. Now, when you take money from an individual and not allow them to apply that on the open exchange, you are infringing upon the generation of wealth. If your interest is in providing a good for society, there's nothing that that can do that quite like raising up the standard of living for people through the pursuit of profit. Now, I'm sticking by this point that that the money they take is to fund Planned Parenthood. The money the government takes to fund Planned Parenthood is taken unjustly. Now, your last statement, you said that taxation was justified. The taxation wasn't theft. Could you please elaborate for that? What for that? Please elaborate that. Please elaborate on that point for me. What makes taxation not theft? Back to you.
Like I said earlier, the reason why I don't think that taxation is theft, and I think it's justified, is because it means that the government is then able to divvy up that money based on what society actually needs. Because the conception here, because the point, by your logic, if people are able to freely spend money on what they think is important, then it means that health services, it means that other institutions are likely to suffer, particularly when people disagree with it, right? And so that's why tax is justified. Whether or not it's taking it from people and it should or shouldn't is irrelevant here, because we are not arguing as to whether or not the government should be able to tax people. We are arguing whether that taxpayer dollar should be given to Planned Parenthood from the government, because at the end of the day, if that funding doesn't go to Planned Parenthood, it's just going to go somewhere else, because the debate here is not whether the government should be taxing people or not. It is whether or not it should be giving some money, regardless of where that money's actually come from, to Planned Parenthood, which is why, like, I don't think I need to justify whether or not taxing is theft or not, because that's not important here. The important thing here is where that money is going. Like, that money could come from elsewhere. It doesn't matter where that money comes from. What is important is whether or not Planned Parenthood deserves having that money because of that funding. And so my first bit of like rebuttal, I guess you could say, for this specific or for your last statement was about wealthy people, and they can probably afford to do these things, and like they're less likely to have unwanted pregnancies, things like that. Yeah, that's cool. Like, it's fine to be wealthy, but what about people who aren't particularly wealthy? Like 60% of the pregnancies that come from 60% of pregnancies that come from teenage women, unmarried women, and low-income earners are actually unintended, which means that more than half of the children that come from non-wealthy people are not intended. And it's much more likely that someone who has that unintended pregnancy is likely to experience things like mental health issues, and those children are likely to suffer as a result of that. And so, like, it all, that free market is fine when you're specifically talking about richer and more wealthy people, but let's be quite clear here, not every single person in America is wealthy enough to afford that money. And by simply not taxing them, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be able to afford that, because that tax money is actually fluctuated based on your income. So if you don't earn anything at all, you're obviously not getting taxed there, which means that you still will not be able to afford that healthcare service, even if the government stops taxing people. Those people who are on low income supplements, they're not going to be able to afford this healthcare service if the government stops taxing it, because they're not getting taxed to start with, or they're not getting taxed at a meaningful level. Like that $10 a week tax that they pay is not actually going to mean much, because they probably don't have enough money to live comfortably as it is. Have that healthcare service and that unwanted pregnancy is probably the last thing on their mind. Like the free market only favors wealthy people.
So the free market only favors wealthy people. I disagree with that. We can look at a nation like South Korea, very, very low standard of living in the early 1950s. Capitalism took hold. They are the envy of the world. South Korea is a great place to live. Look at a place like Japan. Once again, post World War II, their country was decimated. The free market was allowed to flourish, and they have a very, very high standard of living. You keep talking about how the government needs to spend on essential services. My point is, anything that is essential, people will spend money on. If it's essential, the market will find a way. If there is a demand for Planned Parenthood will be funded. You don't have to take money from me against my consent, or anyone else against their consent, to fund Planned Parenthood, if the market can do that, if they can stand upon their own merits. What you're doing is you're creating a quasi monopoly by singling out one institution and providing a subsidy for them. Now, I suppose theoretically you could also subsidize all of its competition, but I don't think that that's really a great way to go about things. I mean, at that point, shit, everybody's going to be getting into the reproductive care game because it's free handouts from the government. Fundamentally, free market does things more efficiently, and in doing so, elevates everyone across the board. Now, back to my first point, talking about being wealthy and that kind of solving some of the ills that Planned Parenthood seeks to remedy. I'm not talking about the 1%. I'm talking about everyone. Everyone will benefit from the free market. I look at the United States. Even the poorest person in the United States has a much higher standard of living than any place where there's really heavy intervention in the market by the government. So I'm gonna pass it back to you.
So my only response at the moment is that, firstly, the free market is not going to be as effective in instances like this for a number of reasons. One, because when you give people free reign over their money, especially when they think that they're getting taxed unjustly, it means that they're likely to spend less of that money because they didn't want to spend it in the first place. But also, secondly, if people do choose to spend money on things that they think are important, it means that just that, they're going to spend that money on things that they think are important, not things that benefit all of society per se. And so the example that I have here is that I think the statistic is close to 50% of Americans are against abortion, which is totally fine. You don't have to like it. You don't have to hate it. But when it comes to 50% of people that disagree with something like that, it means that any institution that propagates whatever that thing that they don't like, it means that they're probably not going to spend on that, which means that half of the funding that Planned Parenthood could potentially get in that free market is not actually going to happen, because people just disagree with it, because people have this like weird conception that Planned Parenthood is this thing or is not this thing. Like, I'm trying to specifically keep it to Planned Parenthood because like that is this debate right now. but also specifically, like, why are people not less likely to spend money on Planned Parenthood? Like I just said, people think that have this misconception about Planned Parenthood and the services that it provides is that it is purely an abortion-driven institution that only deals with abortions, that only has things like that relevant to it. And so it means that in that free market, people are actually less likely to invest in Planned Parenthood. Now, why do I think that that's bad? I think that that's bad because it means that the funding that they get is obviously less, which is a detriment to society. Why is that the case? So, like, let's get some statistics, right? So Planned Parenthood did a survey in 2015. So of like a nationally represented group of people in the United States. And so these are just some of the results and some of the reasonings as to why Planned Parenthood is important. 88% of the people feel that how to ask for some consent in a sexual environment is important, but or should be taught in a high school, but only 21% of those people were taught that at school. In terms of how to say no to sex, 97% think that it should be taught in schools, but only 33 of them were actually taught about that at school. And so, like, almost a third of people think that, you know, simply nodding or even not saying no to sexual advances means that that person is giving consent to have further sexual contact with that person. Like, the things that Planned Parenthood does, particularly in the realm of consent and like sexual education and things like that, are incredibly important. But when people think that Planned Parenthood only deals with abortion, and then the funding for Planned Parenthood then suffers, it means that those services they provide are less, which means that better education that people get from their programs is actually suffering, which means that people are detrimented overall.
So you threw out a statistic: 50% of people don't like abortions. 50% of the people don't like Pepsi. Pepsi still exists. If, as you claim, Planned Parenthood is an essential service for society, the free market is the best way to fund that service. And if it cannot exist under a completely private model, then it has no right existing. That it's the same way for any other company. You still, and this is my main point, the funding from Planned Parenthood should be cut because it comes from an unjustified source. To my mind, you still have not properly justified taxes. You talk about how the government redistributing wealth to essential goods and services is a good thing. So the free market is what decides what is an essential good and service. If people really need it, they will spend money on it. And in a free market model, it will be done more efficiently. It will be done more effectively. This has been shown time and time and time again. That's why the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore, and that's why the United States and the wonderful country of Australia still do exist. It is not by popular vote, does not give the right to theft. You are still taking money against my consent, against somebody else's consent, money that could be applied more effectively, more economically, in some other fashion.
Okay, in the last 20 seconds I have two things. Firstly, most of Planned Parenthood's funding actually comes from non-government anyway. So like that, you know, free market thing still works either case. But even still, like in terms of that, does that mean that if people think that defense isn't like important and they don't want to spend money in that free market, then that then suffers and is good?
So first off, so I'm a veteran. I've been to Afghanistan a couple of times. And it will blow your mind how much money the government shells out to private institutions to do jobs more effectively than they could. IT, even security, actually going out and fighting. Because profit incentive makes people do things more economically, more efficiently. And I hate to belabor this point, but the reason that the budget for Planned Parenthood should be cut is because it is monies levied against another person's consent. If this is an essential goods and services the free market will make sure that this happens. If it's not, well, then it should be cast by the wayside, as any other failed business should. So I'm actually arguing against my own beliefs. I thought it would be fun. So I want to thank my opponent, and you guys should vote for me because, I mean, look, I bled for this debate.